It was supposed to be just another day in the prison yard. Guards watching, prisoners waiting. But then, tension sparked. In a sudden, reckless moment, one prisoner reached out and ripped the female police officer's shirt. The other inmates laughed, expecting humiliation. But within seconds, the laughter died. The prisoner's face went pale. He stumbled back, his eyes locked on what he saw beneath. The entire jail froze, and what was revealed that day would shock everyone inside those walls. Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you stunned. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. What I'm about to tell you happened at Riverside County Correctional Facility on a Tuesday morning that nobody will ever forget. Officer Sarah Martinez had been working corrections for 8 years, and in all that time, she'd never faced anything like what was about to unfold. She was respected by both guards and inmates alike, known for her firm but fair approach to maintaining order in one of the toughest facilities in the state. That morning started like any other. The sun cut through the chain-link fences, casting long shadows across the concrete yard, where 200 inmates were gathered for their daily recreation time. Officer Martinez stood at her usual post near the basketball courts, her radio crackling with routine check-ins from other guards positioned around the perimeter. She wore the standard issue uniform, dark blue with the county corrections badge prominently displayed on her chest. Her hair pulled back in regulation style, but something felt different that day. The air was thick with an unusual tension that even the most experienced officers could sense. Conversations among the inmates seemed more hushed, more urgent. Groups formed and dissolved more quickly than normal. The guards had noticed it during the morning count, that subtle shift in energy that often preceded trouble in places like this. Among the inmates was Marcus Thompson, a man serving his 3rd year for armed robbery. At 34 years old, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who had spent most of his adult life behind bars. His reputation preceded him, known for his quick temper and his tendency to challenge authority whenever he felt he could get away with it. Other prisoners either feared him or sought his approval, understanding that in the complex social hierarchy of prison life, men like Marcus often held significant influence. Marcus had been watching Officer Martinez for weeks, studying her routines, her patterns, the way she interacted with different inmates. To him, she represented everything he resented about the system that had caged him. Young, professional, carrying herself with an authority he felt she hadn't earned. In his twisted logic, she was a target waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity to be brought down to size. That opportunity seemed to present itself when Officer Martinez was called over to break up a minor dispute between 2 inmates near the wait area. As she approached, clipboard in hand, ready to document whatever disciplinary action might be necessary, Marcus saw his chance. The other guards were positioned too far away to intervene quickly. The cameras had blind spots he'd memorized during his time here. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, the kind of moment that burns itself into the memory of everyone present. Marcus approached Officer Martinez from behind as she was speaking to the 2 arguing inmates. His movement was deliberate, calculated, designed to humiliate her in front of the entire yard. With a sudden, violent motion, he grabbed the front of her uniform shirt and yanked downward with enough force to tear the fabric completely. The sound of ripping cloth cut through the ambient noise of the yard like a gunshot. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Basketball games froze with players still holding the ball. Even the guards in the towers turned their attention toward the commotion unfolding below. Marcus stepped back with a cruel smile spreading across his face, expecting to see shock, embarrassment, maybe tears. He anticipated the chaos that would follow, the way other inmates would react to seeing a female officer humiliated, the respect he would gain from this bold act of defiance. In his mind, this was his moment of triumph. his way of striking back at the system that had locked him away. But instead of the reaction he expected, something entirely different happened. The smile vanished from Marcus's face as if someone had physically wiped it away. His eyes widened in genuine shock, then narrowed as he tried to process what he was seeing. The color drained from his cheeks, and he took several stumbling steps backward, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to create distance. Officer Martinez stood there, her torn shirt hanging open, but she wasn't cowering or trying to cover herself. Instead, she stood straight, her chin raised, meeting Marcus's stunned gaze with an expression of quiet strength that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within her. What Marcus saw beneath that torn uniform would change everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd tried to humiliate. Across her chest and abdomen, revealed now for everyone to see, was an intricate network of scars. Not the random marks of accident or misfortune, but the deliberate, methodical scarring that told a story of survival against impossible odds. Burns covered portions of her torso, the kind that came from explosions and fire. Long, straight lines marked where shrapnel had torn through flesh. Circular marks showed where bullets had found their target. But it wasn't just the scars themselves that froze Marcus in his tracks. It was what they represented. These weren't the marks of a victim. They were the badges of a warrior. Someone who had faced death and walked away. Someone who had sacrificed their body in service to something greater than themselves. The silence in the yard was deafening. 200 inmates, men who had seen violence in every form imaginable, men who prided themselves on being tough, on never showing weakness, stood in complete stillness as they processed what they were witnessing. This wasn't the soft, inexperienced officer they had assumed her to be. This was someone who had walked through hell and emerged on the other side. Marcus's hands began to shake. The confident swagger that had defined his approach just moments before had evaporated completely. He found himself face to face with evidence of courage and sacrifice that dwarfed anything he had ever experienced. The woman he had tried to break, to humiliate, to reduce to tears, was revealing a strength that made his own supposed toughness look like a child's game. Other inmates began to move closer, not with the predatory energy that might have followed a successful humiliation, but with something approaching reverence. They were looking at someone who had clearly served in combat, someone who had put their life on the line for others, someone who had paid a price in blood and pain that few could comprehend. The guards in the towers had their hands on their weapons, ready to respond to whatever might happen next, but the expected riot, the chaos, the violence that should have followed such an incident, simply wasn't materializing. Instead, there was this strange, heavy silence, as if the entire facility was holding its breath. Officer Martinez slowly reached up and pulled the torn edges of her shirt together, but she made no move to flee, showed no sign of embarrassment or shame. Her eyes remained fixed on Marcus, who seemed to shrink smaller with each passing second. When she finally spoke, her voice carried across the yard with the kind of authority that came not from a uniform or a badge, but from having faced real danger and emerged victorious. The revelation of those scars was more than just a physical exposure. It was the unveiling of a story that would change how everyone in that facility saw her, saw themselves, and saw what real strength actually looked like. What Marcus had intended as his moment of dominance had become his moment of absolute defeat, not through violence or retaliation, but through the simple revelation of truth. The words that came from Officer Martinez's lips cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Marine Corps, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Her voice didn't waver, didn't crack under the weight of 200 stares. Helmand Province, 2018. That's where I earned most of these. Marcus felt his knees go weak. The Marine Corps. Combat veteran. The scars weren't just marks on her skin. They were a testament to battles fought in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. places where death came suddenly and without warning, places where only the strongest survived. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with," whispered an inmate near the back of the crowd. The comment rippled through the gathered prisoners like electricity through water. Men who had spent years building reputations on toughness and intimidation suddenly found themselves looking at someone whose credentials were written in scar tissue and survival. The largest scar, running from just below her collarbone to her left shoulder, told its own story. An IED explosion that had claimed 3 of her fellow Marines. Officer Martinez had dragged 2 wounded soldiers to safety while taking shrapnel herself. The circular mark near her ribs came from sniper fire during a patrol gone wrong. She'd returned fire while bleeding, covering her squad's retreat to safety. Marcus stumbled backward another step, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The woman he'd tried to humiliate wasn't just any corrections officer. She was a decorated combat veteran who had faced down trained killers armed with military weapons. His petty prison yard dominance games suddenly seemed pathetic in comparison. "I've been shot at by Taliban fighters," Officer Martinez continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've survived mortar attacks that left craters 20 feet wide. I've held dying Marines in my arms while calling for medevac helicopters that might never come." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the yard. "You think ripping my shirt is going to break me?" The transformation in the yard was remarkable. Inmates who moments before had been snickering at what they thought would be Marcus's moment of triumph now looked at him with something approaching disgust. He had targeted a war hero, a woman who had sacrificed her body defending the very freedom that allowed them to breathe outside those prison walls. One of the older inmates, a man named Rodriguez who had served time in 3 different facilities, stepped forward. His weathered face showed a mixture of respect and shame. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "some of us served too. Army, Navy, Marines. We recognize what those scars mean." He shot a withering look at Marcus. "And we don't appreciate punks who disrespect those who bled for this country." The social dynamics of the prison yard were shifting in real time. Marcus, who had built his reputation on intimidation and violence, suddenly found himself isolated. Other inmates were stepping away from him, creating physical distance that spoke louder than words. In prison hierarchy, there were unwritten rules, and attacking a combat veteran was crossing a line that even hardened criminals understood. Officer Martinez began buttoning her torn shirt, but she did it slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact with Marcus. "You want to know something interesting about combat?" she asked, her tone almost conversational now. "It teaches you to recognize real threats versus posturing, real danger versus playground bullying." She tilted her head slightly. "Guess which category you fall into?" Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. No words came out. The swagger, the confidence, the predatory energy that had defined his approach just minutes earlier had completely evaporated. He was face to face with someone who had stared down actual enemies of the United States, someone who had earned their authority through blood and sacrifice rather than prison politics and intimidation. The guards in the towers were still watching, but they could sense the shift in energy. What should have been a dangerous situation requiring immediate intervention had become something else entirely. A teaching moment, a demonstration of what real strength looked like, versus the artificial toughness that thrived in places like this. "During my second deployment," Officer Martinez continued, "we were pinned down for 6 hours by enemy fire. Temperature was 120 degrees. We ran out of water. 2 of my Marines were wounded and couldn't move on their own. You know what I did?" She took a step closer to Marcus, who instinctively backed away. "I carried them, both of them, through enemy territory, under fire, for 3 miles. The details of her service record were painting a picture that made every man in that yard reassess their understanding of courage. This wasn't someone who had earned their position through connections or politics. This was a warrior who had paid for their authority with blood, sweat, and sacrifice in the most dangerous places on earth. Another inmate, a younger man with gang tattoos covering his arms, spoke up from the crowd. "My brother died in Afghanistan," he said quietly. "Roadside bomb outside Kandahar. Marines like you probably tried to save him." His voice cracked slightly. "Thank you for your service, Officer Martinez." The comment sparked something unexpected. Other inmates began speaking up, sharing stories of brothers, sons, fathers who had served. Men who had never shown vulnerability in the harsh environment of prison suddenly found themselves opening up about loss, about sacrifice, about respect for those who had worn the uniform. Marcus stood at the center of this transformation, watching his carefully constructed reputation crumble in real time. The woman he had tried to victimize was being honored by the very men he had counted on to support his actions. The prison yard hierarchy that had placed him near the top was reorganizing itself around principles he had never bothered to understand. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" Officer Martinez asked, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversations around them. "I volunteered to face danger to protect others. You prey on people you think are weaker than you." She shook her head slowly. "That's not strength. That's cowardice." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. In a place where reputation meant everything, where being labeled weak could be a matter of life and death. Officer Martinez had just publicly branded Marcus with the worst possible designation: coward. But she wasn't finished. "Those scars you exposed? Each one represents a moment when I chose to stand between evil and innocence, when I chose sacrifice over safety, when I chose service over self-preservation." Her eyes blazed with an intensity that made grown men look away. "What have you ever sacrificed for anyone other than yourself?" Marcus had no answer. How could he? His entire adult life had been about taking what he wanted, about dominating others, about serving his own interests at any cost, standing before a woman who had literally bled for strangers, for principles, for something greater than herself. His entire worldview was collapsing. The silence stretched on, heavy with implications that would ripple through the facility for months to come. Officer Martinez had not only defended herself against Marcus's attack, she had fundamentally altered the power structure of the entire prison. Respect was no longer about who could fight the hardest or intimidate the most people. It was about who had earned their place through genuine sacrifice and service. What happened next would determine whether this moment became a turning point or simply another story told in prison cells after lights out. The transformation happening in that prison yard was unlike anything the guards had witnessed in their combined decades of service. Officer Martinez stood there, her torn uniform a stark contrast to the reverence now radiating from the crowd of inmates around her. But Marcus wasn't done yet. His humiliation was turning into something darker, more dangerous. The silence that had fallen over the yard began to crack as Marcus's shock transformed into rage. His face flushed red as the reality of his situation sank in. He had just publicly attacked a decorated war veteran in front of 200 witnesses, and now those same witnesses were treating her like a hero while looking at him with disgust. The prison hierarchy he had spent years climbing was crumbling beneath his feet. "I don't care what those scars mean," Marcus suddenly snarled, his voice cutting through the respectful murmurs of the crowd. "You're still just a woman in a uniform trying to control me." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "War hero or not, you're in my house now." The words were a mistake, a catastrophic miscalculation that would haunt him for the rest of his sentence. The moment they left his lips, the energy in the yard shifted again. But this time it wasn't reverence or shock. It was pure, concentrated anger directed squarely at him. Rodriguez, the older inmate who had spoken earlier, stepped forward with a look that could have melted steel. "Your house?" he growled, his weathered face twisted with contempt. "Boy, you just disrespected every service member who ever wore a uniform. You think that makes you tough?" Other inmates began moving closer, forming a tight circle around Marcus. These weren't his usual followers or admirers. These were men who had served, who had lost family members in combat, who understood the weight of sacrifice that Officer Martinez's scars represented. The prison yard politics that had protected Marcus for years were about to turn against him in the most brutal way possible. Officer Martinez held up her hand, a gesture that immediately stopped the advancing inmates in their tracks. The authority in that simple movement was absolute, commanding instant obedience from men who had never backed down from anyone. "Stand down," she said firmly. "All of you." The inmates froze, caught between their desire to defend her honor and their ingrained respect for her authority. It was a remarkable display of leadership, the kind that couldn't be taught in training academies or learned from textbooks. This was command presence earned through combat, through leading Marines in life-or-death situations where hesitation meant casualties. "You want to know about my house, Marcus?" Officer Martinez asked, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent yard. "My house was a forward operating base in Helmand Province. Mud walls, sandbag barriers, and the constant sound of incoming mortars. My house was where I held 19-year-old Marines as they bled out from IED explosions." She began walking toward him, each step measured and deliberate. Marcus tried to stand his ground, but his body betrayed him, taking small steps backward as she approached. The other inmates watched in fascination as this decorated veteran schooled a prison tough guy on what real adversity looked like. "My house was where I learned that strength isn't about intimidating people weaker than you," she continued, her voice growing more intense with each word. "It's about standing up when everything inside you wants to fall down. It's about carrying wounded soldiers through enemy fire when your own body is screaming in pain." The crowd was hanging on every word. These were men who had heard every tough guy speech, every intimidation tactic, every claim of superiority that prison life produced. But this was different. This was truth spoken by someone who had earned the right to speak it through blood and sacrifice. "You think ripping my shirt was some kind of victory?" Officer Martinez asked, now standing just 3 feet from Marcus. "I've had my uniform torn by shrapnel from rocket-propelled grenades. I've had my gear destroyed by explosions that left my ears ringing for days. You think your little tantrum compares to that?" Marcus was sweating now, despite the morning chill. The woman he had tried to humiliate was systematically dismantling everything he thought he knew about power and respect. Every word she spoke was backed by experiences that made his prison reputation seem laughably insignificant. "During my 3rd deployment," Officer Martinez continued, "we were ambushed while escorting a convoy of supplies to a remote outpost. The lead vehicle hit an IED. The Taliban opened fire from 3 directions. We were outnumbered 5 to 1. She paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. "You know what I did?" The entire yard leaned forward, waiting for the answer. Even the guards in the towers had abandoned their usual patrol patterns, drawn in by the raw authenticity of her story. "I called in air support, organized a defensive perimeter, and then ran through enemy fire to pull the driver from the burning lead vehicle. Took a bullet in the shoulder doing it." She gestured to one of the scars visible through her torn shirt. "That's this one right here. Want to know why I did it?" Marcus couldn't speak. His mouth had gone completely dry, and his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. "Because that's what Marines do," Officer Martinez answered her own question. "We don't leave people behind. We don't prey on the weak. We stand between danger and the innocent, no matter the cost." Her eyes bored into his, "Something you clearly don't understand." An inmate named Williams, a man serving time for armed robbery, but who had served 2 tours in Iraq, stepped forward from the crowd. "Officer Martinez," he said respectfully, "some of us have been in combat too. We know what those scars represent, and we want you to know that not all of us are like this fool." He jerked his head toward Marcus with obvious disgust. The comment opened floodgates. Other veterans in the prison began speaking up, sharing their own service records, their own experiences with combat, their own understanding of what real sacrifice looked like. The prison yard was transforming into something resembling a veterans' gathering, with Officer Martinez at the center, respected and honored by men who had walked similar paths. Marcus found himself completely isolated. The inmates who had once sought his approval were now actively shunning him. The reputation he had built over years of intimidation and violence was evaporating in real time, replaced by something much worse than mere dislike. He was being branded as someone who attacked heroes. "You know what the worst part is?" asked an inmate named Jackson, a former Navy sailor serving time for drug trafficking. "Some of us have daughters, sisters, mothers who might serve their country someday. And this piece of trash thinks it's acceptable to assault a woman who's already sacrificed more for this country than he ever will." The crowd murmured agreement, and Marcus realized that his situation was deteriorating rapidly. In prison, attacking a woman was already considered cowardly, but attacking a decorated combat veteran crossed lines that even hardened criminals respected. He was no longer just facing social isolation. He was facing active hostility from nearly every inmate in the facility. Officer Martinez sensed the dangerous energy building in the crowd and made another command decision. "I said stand down, and I meant it," she ordered, her voice cutting through the angry murmurs. Justice doesn't come from mob action. It comes from the system working the way it's supposed to. She turned to Marcus, who was now visibly trembling. "You made a choice today. A bad choice that revealed who you really are. But I'm going to give you an opportunity that you don't deserve and certainly haven't earned." The yard fell silent again, everyone waiting to hear what kind of opportunity a combat veteran might offer to someone who had just assaulted her. "You can apologize," she said simply. "Right here, right now, in front of everyone. You can acknowledge that what you did was wrong, that you disrespected not just me, but every person who has ever worn a uniform in service to this country. You can show these men that you're capable of recognizing a mistake and taking responsibility for it." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It was more mercy than Marcus deserved, more compassion than anyone expected, but it also represented his only chance to salvage anything from this catastrophic miscalculation. Marcus looked around the yard, seeing faces that ranged from disappointed to openly hostile. These were men who had once respected him, feared him, sought his approval. Now they were waiting to see if he had any honor left, any capacity for accountability and growth. The seconds ticked by like hours as Marcus wrestled with his pride, his ego, and his rapidly diminishing options. The woman standing before him had offered him a path to redemption, but taking it would mean admitting weakness in a place where weakness could be fatal. What he decided in that moment would determine not just his own fate, but the respect that Officer Martinez had just earned from 200 hardened criminals. The entire prison was watching, waiting to see if even someone like Marcus could recognize true strength when it stood before him, scarred but unbroken, offering mercy he had never shown to anyone else. The choice was his to make, but the consequences would ripple through every corridor, every cell block, every corner of the facility for years to come. In attacking Officer Martinez, Marcus had inadvertently revealed something powerful about honor, sacrifice, and the difference between real strength and mere brutality. The prison yard had become a classroom, and everyone present was about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The weight of Marcus's decision pressed down on the prison yard like a suffocating blanket. 200 inmates held their breath, guards watched from their towers, and Officer Martinez stood waiting with the patience of someone who had learned to endure far worse than this moment of suspended judgment. Marcus's eyes darted around the circle of faces surrounding him. These weren't anonymous strangers anymore. They were witnesses to his humiliation, judges of his character, men who would remember this moment long after the concrete had absorbed the last echo of whatever words he chose to speak next. His reputation, built over years of calculated violence and intimidation, hung by a thread so thin it might snap at any moment. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable, then unbearable. Officer Martinez didn't fidget or look away. She simply waited, her torn uniform a stark reminder of what had brought them all to this pivotal moment. The scars visible through the ripped fabric told stories of courage that made the current standoff seem almost trivial by comparison. Finally, Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled sound emerged. He cleared his throat and tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. He began, then stopped, swallowing hard. The words seemed to stick in his throat like broken glass. "Speak up," called Rodriguez from the crowd. "If you're gonna apologize to this hero, let everyone hear it." The challenge in Rodriguez's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just about Marcus apologizing to Officer Martinez anymore. This was about him publicly acknowledging the fundamental difference between real strength and the artificial toughness that had defined his prison existence. Marcus's hands were shaking now, and he shoved them into his pockets to hide the tremor. "Officer Martinez," he said, his voice slightly stronger but still unsteady. "I was wrong." The words came out rushed, as if he needed to expel them before he lost his nerve entirely. But Officer Martinez shook her head slowly. "That's not enough," she said firmly. "Wrong about what, specifically? What exactly are you apologizing for?" The question forced Marcus to confront the full scope of his actions. It wasn't enough to offer a generic apology. He had to acknowledge what he'd done, what it meant, and why it was so fundamentally unacceptable. "I attacked you," Marcus said, the words coming out in a rush. "I tried to humiliate you in front of everyone because I thought—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Because I thought you were just another guard I could push around. And now?" Officer Martinez prompted, her voice calm but insistent. Marcus looked at the scars visible through her torn shirt, then back up to her face. "Now I know I was wrong about everything. About you. About what real strength looks like." His voice cracked slightly. "You're a war hero, and I'm just some punk who's never done anything brave in his entire life." The admission hung in the air like a confession in church. Other inmates shifted uncomfortably, recognizing perhaps a bit of themselves in Marcus's brutal self-assessment. How many of them had built their identities around intimidation rather than genuine accomplishment? How many had mistaken the ability to hurt others for actual strength? Williams, the former Iraq veteran, stepped forward from the crowd. "You know what, Martinez?" he said, addressing Officer Martinez directly. "Maybe this fool can learn something from this. Maybe we all can." He turned to face Marcus with eyes that had seen combat. "You want to know what real tough looks like? It's not attacking people you think are weaker than you. It's standing up when everything inside you wants to fall down." The comment sparked something unexpected. Other inmates began sharing their own stories, their own moments of recognition about the difference between authentic strength and mere brutality. A man named Carter talked about his grandfather, a World War II veteran who had never raised his voice but commanded respect through quiet dignity. Another inmate mentioned his son, born after his incarceration, and how he wanted to be the kind of man the boy could be proud of. Officer Martinez listened to these spontaneous testimonials with something approaching amazement. Her assault had somehow catalyzed a conversation about honor, respect, and what it truly meant to be strong. Men who had spent years hiding vulnerability behind walls of aggression were suddenly opening up about their deepest fears and highest aspirations. But the moment wasn't lost on the practical realities of their situation. A guard's voice crackled over the radio, calling for a status update. The morning recreation period was nearly over, and normal prison routines would need to resume. The administrative machinery of the correctional facility couldn't pause indefinitely for philosophical discussions about courage and character. Officer Martinez keyed her radio. "Control, this is Martinez. Situation in the yard is stable. No injuries, no ongoing incidents. Request permission to extend recreation period by 15 minutes for debriefing." The response came back immediately. "Martinez, what's your status on the reported assault?" She looked at Marcus, who was still trembling slightly, but had managed to maintain eye contact with her. "Incident resolved through de-escalation. Perpetrator has acknowledged wrongdoing and expressed genuine remorse. Recommend administrative review rather than emergency response." The radio crackled again. "Copy that, Martinez. 15-minute extension approved. Report to administration after yard recall." The brief exchange reminded everyone present that this moment existed within a larger system of rules, procedures, and consequences. Marcus's apology, however sincere, didn't erase what he had done. There would still be disciplinary action, legal ramifications, and administrative processes to navigate. But something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between Officer Martinez and the inmate population. The respect she commanded now wasn't based on fear or authority alone. It was based on recognition of her sacrifice, her service, and her character. She had transformed from just another corrections officer into something approaching a revered figure. Marcus seemed to understand this shift better than anyone. "Officer Martinez," he said quietly, "I know saying sorry doesn't fix what I did. I know there's going to be consequences, and I deserve whatever happens to me." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "But I want you to know that I learned something today. About respect, about what it really means to serve something bigger than yourself." The transformation in Marcus was visible to everyone watching. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that might have been genuine humility. The predatory energy that had defined his approach to prison life had been stripped away, revealing someone who might actually be capable of growth and change. Other inmates noticed the change too. Jackson, the former Navy sailor, nodded approvingly. "Maybe there's hope for you yet, Marcus. Takes a real man to admit when he's been wrong." But not everyone in the yard was ready to embrace Marcus's apparent transformation. A group of younger inmates, men who had looked up to his reputation for violence and intimidation, watched the proceedings with obvious disappointment. To them, Marcus's apology represented weakness, capitulation to authority they had been taught to resist. One of them, a 22-year-old named Rico serving time for gang-related charges, stepped forward with a sneer on his face. "So that's it?" he called out, his voice dripping with contempt. "Big bad Marcus gets schooled by a female guard and suddenly he's all apologetic? What happened to not backing down from nobody?" The comment created a new tension in the yard. Marcus found himself caught between his newfound understanding of genuine strength and the expectations of inmates who had respected him for all the wrong reasons. This was the real test of his transformation. Would he revert to his old patterns when challenged? Or had something fundamental actually changed? Officer Martinez watched this new dynamic unfold with interest. She understood that Marcus's journey toward accountability was far from over. Apologizing to her was just the first step. The real challenge would be maintaining that growth when faced with pressure from those who preferred the old Marcus, the one who solved problems with aggression rather than introspection. The yard fell silent again, as everyone waited to see how Marcus would respond to Rico's challenge. This moment would determine whether his apology had been genuine or merely expedient, whether he was truly capable of change or simply good at adapting his behavior to avoid consequences. Marcus looked at Rico, then at Officer Martinez, then back at the crowd of inmates who were watching this drama unfold. The choice he made in the next few seconds would define not just his own future, but the entire lesson that had emerged from this confrontation. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and clear, carrying across the yard with surprising authority. "You know what, Rico? You're right about one thing. I did get schooled today, by someone who's earned the right to teach lessons about real strength." He gestured toward Officer Martinez. "This woman has been shot at by trained killers. She's carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire. She's sacrificed her body defending our freedom." His voice grew stronger with each word. "And I thought I was tough because I could intimidate people in prison?" Rico's sneer faltered slightly, but he pressed on. So now you're just gonna roll over every time some guard. She's not just some guard, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through Rico's protest. She's a decorated Marine who's done more for this country in one deployment than any of us have done in our entire lives. And if you can't see the difference between respecting someone who's earned it and rolling over for authority, then you've got a lot more growing up to do than I thought. The confrontation between Marcus and Rico represented more than just a disagreement about how to respond to authority. It was a clash between two different philosophies of what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be strong, and what deserved respect in a world where violence often masqueraded as virtue. Other inmates found themselves choosing sides, not through words, but through positioning. Those who supported Marcus's new perspective moved closer to him and Officer Martinez. Those who agreed with Rico's more traditional prison mindset clustered around the younger inmate. The physical geography of the yard began to reflect the philosophical divisions that Marcus's transformation had revealed. Officer Martinez realized that her torn shirt had exposed more than just her combat scars. It had revealed fault lines in the prison community that ran much deeper than anyone had suspected. The conversation happening around her wasn't just about one inmate's moment of poor judgment. It was about fundamental questions of honor, respect, and what it truly meant to be strong in a world that often rewarded the wrong kinds of behavior. The 15-minute extension she had requested was nearly up, but the lessons being learned in the prison yard that morning would continue long after the inmates returned to their cells. Marcus's attack on her uniform had inadvertently created a teaching moment that would ripple through the facility for months to come. As the guards began preparing for yard recall, Officer Martinez made one final observation that would stick with everyone present. "You know what I learned in combat?" she said, her voice carrying clearly across the divided yard. "The strongest people aren't the ones who never fall down. They're the ones who get back up, learn from their mistakes, and become better than they were before." She looked directly at Marcus, then at Rico, then at every face in the crowd. "Every single one of you has the capacity to be better than your worst moment. The question is whether you'll choose growth or whether you'll stay trapped by pride." The words hung in the air as the call came over the loudspeakers for all inmates to return to their housing units. The morning recreation period was officially over, but the real education was just beginning. As the inmates began filing toward the exits, the conversations continued in small groups. Some discussed Officer Martinez's service record with obvious admiration. Others debated whether Marcus's transformation was genuine or calculated. Still others wondered what this incident might mean for the broader culture of the facility. Marcus found himself walking alone, no longer surrounded by the usual cluster of followers who had sought his approval and protection. The isolation was uncomfortable, but not entirely unwelcome. For the first time in years, he had space to think about who he wanted to be rather than who others expected him to be. Officer Martinez remained in the yard as the last inmates filed out, straightening her torn uniform as best she could before heading to the administrative offices to file her report. The morning had not gone according to plan, but the outcome had been more meaningful than anyone could have anticipated. The scars on her chest and abdomen, now hidden again beneath the fabric of her shirt, had told their story. They had spoken of sacrifice and service, of courage under fire and strength in the face of adversity. They had transformed a moment of intended humiliation into a powerful lesson about what it truly meant to be strong. As she walked toward the administration building, Officer Martinez reflected on the unexpected turn her day had taken. She had come to work expecting routine security duties and mundane administrative tasks. Instead, she had found herself at the center of a transformation that might change the entire culture of the facility. The report she would file would be straightforward and factual, but the real story of what had happened in the prison yard that morning was already being written in the minds and hearts of 200 inmates who had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen what happened when real strength met false bravado. They had learned the difference between authentic courage and manufactured toughness. Most importantly, they had discovered that redemption was possible, even for those who had made terrible choices. The torn shirt that had started it all would be replaced by a new uniform by the end of the day. But the lessons revealed by what lay beneath would endure far longer than any piece of clothing ever could. The transformation that had begun in the prison yard that morning continued to ripple through the facility like shock waves from an earthquake. As inmates filed back to their housing units, the conversations that had started around Officer Martinez's revelation grew into something much larger than anyone had anticipated. Cell blocks that had been divided by gang affiliations, racial tensions, and territorial disputes suddenly found common ground in discussing what they had witnessed. In Cell Block C, where Marcus had held considerable influence for over 2 years, the dynamics shifted dramatically within hours of the yard incident. Inmates who had once sought his approval now questioned everything they thought they knew about strength and respect. The younger prisoners, especially those who had looked up to Marcus as a role model, found themselves grappling with fundamental questions about what it meant to be a man in a place where violence had always been the currency of power. Tommy Reeves, a 19-year-old serving his first sentence, sat on his narrow bunk staring at the concrete ceiling as his cellmate, an older man named Davis, shared stories about his own military service. For the first time since arriving at the facility 6 months earlier, Tommy found himself thinking about his future beyond these walls, rather than just surviving day by day. "You know what got to me most?" Tommy said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over their cell. It wasn't just that she was tough. It was the way she carried herself after Marcus tore her shirt, like she wasn't ashamed of those scars, like they were something to be proud of. Davis nodded, understanding the deeper implications of what the young man was processing. "Son, those scars weren't marks of weakness. They were proof of service. There's a difference between getting hurt because you made stupid choices and getting hurt because you stood between danger and innocent people." The conversation was happening in cells throughout the facility. Veterans who had kept their service records private suddenly found themselves sharing stories about deployments, about friends lost in combat, about the difficulty of transitioning back to civilian life. Non-veterans listened with a new understanding of what sacrifice actually meant. But not everyone embraced the lessons that Officer Martinez's revelation had provided. In Cell Block A, Rico gathered a small group of like-minded inmates who viewed Marcus's transformation as betrayal rather than growth. To them, the prison hierarchy that had maintained order through fear and intimidation was being undermined by what they saw as weakness disguised as enlightenment. "This is exactly what's wrong with this place," Rico complained to his followers as they sat around a makeshift table in the common area. One female guard shows off some old scars, and suddenly everyone's acting like she's some kind of hero. "We're supposed to be convicts, not Boy Scouts." His words found receptive ears among inmates who had built their identities around resistance to authority and rejection of conventional values. They saw Officer Martinez's influence as a threat to the culture they understood, the unwritten rules that had governed their interactions for years. The division was creating tension that the guards could feel but couldn't quite identify. Veteran corrections officers knew that major incidents often followed periods of unusual philosophical conflict among inmates. When belief systems clashed in confined spaces, violence typically followed. Meanwhile, in the administrative offices, Officer Martinez sat across from Deputy Warden Patricia Chen, providing a detailed account of the morning's events. The paperwork required for such incidents was extensive, but both women understood that the real significance of what had happened couldn't be captured in official forms and reports. "In 23 years of corrections work," Deputy Warden Chen said as she reviewed Martinez's written statement, "I've never seen anything quite like what you've described. An assault that turned into a teaching moment, an inmate population divided over questions of honor and respect, rather than territory or contraband." Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably in her chair, still feeling the weight of 200 stares from the morning's confrontation. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I handled it correctly. Department policy clearly states that any physical assault on staff should result in immediate lockdown and emergency response. I made a judgment call to de-escalate instead, and that judgment call may have prevented a riot," Chen replied firmly. "Sometimes the manual doesn't account for the human element. What you did out there, sharing your story, connecting with those men as fellow service members, that created an opportunity for real change." The deputy warden stood and walked to her window, which provided a clear view of the prison yard where the morning's drama had unfolded. "We've been struggling with rising tension in this facility for months. Gang conflicts, racial incidents, attacks on staff increasing every quarter. What happened today might be exactly what we needed to reset the culture. But resetting culture in a correctional facility was more complicated than inspiring a single moment of reflection. The inmates who had been moved by Officer Martinez's story would return to the same cells, the same routines, the same pressures that had shaped their behavior for years. The question was whether the impact would be lasting or whether old patterns would reassert themselves once the initial emotional response faded. Dr. Sarah Williams, the facility's psychologist, had observed the yard incident from her office window and requested an immediate meeting with Deputy Warden Chen. Her professional assessment would be crucial in determining how to build on the morning's unexpected breakthrough. What we witnessed today was a perfect example of cognitive dissonance resolution, Dr. Williams explained as she joined the meeting with Martinez and Chen. Marcus had built his identity around a particular understanding of power and respect. When confronted with evidence that contradicted that understanding, he had two choices: reject the new information or modify his beliefs. She pulled out a tablet containing her preliminary notes from observing the yard interaction. The fact that he chose to acknowledge his mistake and modify his worldview in public, in front of his peer group, suggests a level of psychological flexibility that's actually quite rare in this population. Officer Martinez listened to the clinical analysis of Marcus's transformation with mixed feelings. She had witnessed something that felt deeply personal and human being reduced to psychological terminology, but she also understood that the professional perspective might be necessary for creating lasting change. The challenge now, Dr. Williams continued, is supporting that transformation while managing the inevitable backlash from inmates who view Marcus's change as weakness or betrayal. We're likely to see increased tension between different philosophical factions among the inmate population. Her prediction proved accurate sooner than anyone expected. By evening chow time, the divisions that had emerged in the yard had crystallized into something approaching open hostility. Marcus found himself eating alone at a table that had previously been surrounded by followers and admirers. The isolation was stark and uncomfortable, but he was beginning to understand it as necessary for genuine growth. At a nearby table, Rico held court with a growing group of inmates who shared his rejection of what they saw as weakness disguised as enlightenment. Their conversations grew louder and more aggressive as the meal progressed, clearly intended to provoke Marcus into responding with his old patterns of intimidation and violence. "Look at that," Rico said loudly enough for Marcus to hear. "Used to be someone you could count on to stand up to the guards. Now he's probably writing love letters to his new hero." The comment drew snickers from Rico's supporters, but it also caught the attention of the veterans in the dining hall. Williams, the former Iraq veteran, stood up from his table and walked over to where Rico was sitting. "You got something to say about service members?" Williams asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Because if you do, you can say it to my face instead of talking loud enough for the whole dining hall to hear." The confrontation represented exactly the kind of escalation that correctional officers feared most. Two strong personalities, representing different philosophies about respect and authority, facing off in a space filled with volatile individuals looking for any excuse to release pent-up aggression. But before Rico could respond, Marcus surprised everyone by standing up and walking over to the increasingly tense situation. His movement caught the attention of every inmate and guard in the dining hall, creating a silence that felt heavy with potential violence. "Williams," Marcus said quietly, placing a hand on the veteran's shoulder. "I appreciate you standing up for what's right, but this isn't your fight. It's mine." He turned to face Rico directly, and for a moment, the old Marcus seemed to resurface. The predatory energy, the coiled readiness for violence, the intimidating presence that had made him feared throughout the facility. Rico's confident expression faltered slightly as he recognized the potential for serious physical confrontation. But then Marcus did something that shocked everyone present. Instead of escalating the situation, he sat down at Rico's table directly across from the younger inmate and began speaking in a voice just loud enough for the immediate area to hear. "You want to know what I learned today, Rico?" Marcus asked, his tone conversational rather than threatening. "I learned that real strength isn't about never backing down. It's about being strong enough to admit when you're wrong." Rico shifted uncomfortably, clearly prepared for physical confrontation, but unsure how to respond to this unexpected approach. The other inmates at his table exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that the dynamic they had expected was shifting in ways they couldn't predict. "Officer Martinez showed me scars from fighting real enemies," Marcus continued. "Not other prisoners, not people locked up and desperate. Real enemies with real weapons who wanted to kill her and everyone she was protecting." He leaned forward slightly. "You ever face anything like that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but it wasn't the kind of challenge that could be answered with violence or bravado. It was a challenge to examine the foundation of one's beliefs about courage, strength, and what deserved respect. Rico's response came out as a mumble, barely audible even to those sitting at the same table. "That's different. That's military stuff. This is prison. Different rules." "Is it different?" Marcus asked, his voice growing stronger. "Or have we been telling ourselves it's different because it's easier than admitting we've been wrong about what real toughness looks like?" The conversation was being watched by every person in the dining hall. Guards had positioned themselves strategically around the room, ready to intervene if violence erupted, but also recognizing that something significant was happening that might be more valuable than any formal mediation or counseling session. Other inmates began joining the discussion, not by moving to Rico's table, but by contributing comments from their own seats. The dining hall transformed from a tense standoff into something resembling a community conversation about values, respect, and the difference between authentic strength and mere aggression. Jackson, the former Navy sailor, spoke up from across the room. "You know what Marcus is talking about, Rico. Most of us came in here thinking we were tough because we could hurt people or take what we wanted. But that's not tough. That's just predatory." A man named Patterson, serving time for armed robbery, nodded in agreement. "My grandfather was in Korea. Never talked about it, never bragged about it. But you could see it in the way he carried himself. He didn't need to prove anything to anybody because he'd already proven everything that mattered." The stories began flowing naturally. Inmates sharing memories of family members who had served, of friends lost to violence, of moments when they had witnessed genuine courage rather than manufactured toughness. The dining hall became a space for reflection and honest assessment in ways that no formal program or counseling session had ever achieved. But the transformation wasn't universal or complete. Several inmates remained committed to the old ways of thinking, viewing the philosophical shift as dangerous weakness that would make the facility less safe for everyone. Their resistance created an undercurrent of tension that experienced officers recognized as potentially explosive. Officer Martinez, who had been observing the dining hall interaction from the guard station, made a decision that would further complicate the already complex dynamics at play. She requested permission to address the entire inmate population during evening count, something that had never been done in the facility's history. Deputy Warden Chen initially rejected the request as too risky, but Dr. Williams supported the idea as an opportunity to channel the energy of the day's events in a constructive direction. After considerable debate, permission was granted with strict conditions and additional security measures. As word spread that Officer Martinez would be speaking to the entire population, anticipation and anxiety built throughout the facility. Some inmates saw it as an opportunity for further learning and growth. Others viewed it as an unprecedented breach of the traditional barriers between guards and prisoners. The evening count would typically be a routine administrative process, inmates standing by their bunks while officers verified their presence and secured the facility for the night. But this evening would be different, marking another step in the ongoing transformation that had begun with a torn shirt and revealed scars in the prison yard that morning. What Officer Martinez would say to 2,000 inmates and how they would respond would determine whether the day's lessons became a lasting change or simply another story told in prison cells after lights out. The stakes couldn't be higher, and everyone involved understood that they were participating in something unprecedented in the facility's history. The torn uniform had been replaced hours earlier, but the impact of what it had revealed continued to reverberate through every corridor, every cell block, every conversation happening behind bars. The question now was whether that impact would grow into genuine transformation, or whether the old patterns would reassert themselves once the initial shock wore off. As evening approached and the facility prepared for the unprecedented address, both inmates and staff understood that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The morning's incident had cracked open assumptions and beliefs that had governed behavior for decades. What happened next would determine whether those cracks became foundations for something better or simply wounds that never properly healed. The prison yard where it all began lay empty now, bathed in the orange light of setting sun streaming through razor wire and concrete walls. But the lessons learned there that morning were still spreading, still challenging people to examine what they believed about strength, courage, and what it truly meant to be worthy of respect. The evening announcement echoed through every corridor of Riverside County Correctional Facility with unprecedented gravity. All inmates report to designated areas for mandatory assembly. This is not a drill. All inmates report to designated areas immediately. The words carried weight that veteran prisoners recognized instantly. In 30 years of operation, the facility had never called a full population assembly outside of emergency lockdowns or riot protocols. The atmosphere crackled with tension as 2,000 inmates filed into the gymnasium, their movements watched by triple the usual number of guards positioned strategically throughout the massive space. Officer Martinez stood at the front of the gymnasium, her replacement uniform crisp and professional, but everyone present knew what lay beneath that fabric. The scars that had transformed Marcus Thompson from predator to penitent were hidden again, but their impact continued to reverberate through every conversation, every glance, every interaction happening around her. The inmates settled into their assigned sections with unusual discipline. The philosophical divisions that had emerged throughout the day were visible in their seating arrangements. Veterans gravitated toward the front, their posture respectful and attentive. The younger inmates who had embraced the morning's lessons sat nearby, eager to hear more from the woman who had redefined their understanding of strength. But in the back sections, a different energy simmered. Rico and his followers had positioned themselves as far from Officer Martinez as possible, their body language radiating defiance and resentment. They viewed this assembly as an extension of what they saw as manipulation, an attempt to weaponize sympathy and military service to undermine the natural order of prison hierarchy. Marcus found himself in an awkward middle ground, literally and figuratively. He sat alone in a section typically reserved for high-status inmates, but his isolation reflected his complicated position in the facility's evolving social structure. No longer the intimidating figure he had been that morning, but not yet accepted by those who had embraced Officer Martinez's message of authentic strength. Deputy Warden Chen stepped forward to introduce the speaker, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium's sound system. Inmates of Riverside County Correctional Facility, Today's events have created an opportunity for dialogue that we believe could benefit everyone in this community. Officer Martinez has requested permission to share her perspective on the incident that occurred during morning recreation. She paused, scanning the sea of faces before her. This is voluntary participation. Anyone who wishes to return to their housing unit may request escort. However, we encourage you to listen with open minds and consider what you might learn from someone who has served our country with distinction. Not a single inmate moved toward the exits. Even those who opposed the philosophical shift wanted to hear what Officer Martinez would say, if only to find ammunition for their resistance to what they saw as unwelcome change. Officer Martinez approached the microphone with the same calm confidence she had displayed in the yard that morning. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone who had addressed troops before combat missions, but also the warmth of someone who understood that healing required vulnerability as much as strength. "My name is Elena Martinez," she began, using her first name for the first time in any interaction with inmates. "I've been a corrections officer here for 8 years, but before that, I was Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, United States Marine Corps. I served 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan, and I came home with wounds that changed everything about how I understood strength, courage, and what it means to serve others." The gymnasium was absolutely silent. Even the guards seemed to lean forward, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their professional experience. This morning, one of you made a choice that he regrets," Martinez continued, her eyes finding Marcus in the crowd. "He tried to humiliate me by exposing what he thought would be weakness. Instead, he revealed something I've spent years learning to be proud of. These scars aren't marks of failure. They're evidence of battles fought for something greater than myself." She walked closer to the seated inmates, abandoning the formal podium setup. "But here's what I really want you to understand. Every single person in this room has scars too. Maybe not visible ones, but wounds from choices made, from pain inflicted and received, from systems that failed you or that you failed to engage with constructively." A murmur rippled through the crowd as inmates processed this unexpected acknowledgement of their own struggles and circumstances. And that's how one moment of intended cruelty became a catalyst for transformation that nobody saw coming. Officer Martinez's scars didn't just tell the story of her own courage, they revealed the potential for redemption that exists in even the darkest places. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the wounds we're brave enough to show.